needed to get away for a while. That's all it was. Things had piled up back home. Job stress, bills, people constantly needing something from me. I felt like I hadn't had a moment to myself in years. I wasn't looking for anything special. Just a few days of peace and quiet where no one could reach me. No calls, no texts, just silence. I rented a cabin I found through a listing online. It wasn't on any of the big rental sites. Just a small, simple post buried on a local forum. The photos showed a small wooden structure deep in the woods, somewhere up north. The listing said it was quiet, isolated, and surrounded by miles of forest in all directions. There was a generator, some basic furniture, a wood stove, and not much else. No internet, no cell service. That was the selling point. It was cheap too, which should have been a red flag. But at the time, I didn't care. I booked it for 6 days and didn't tell anyone where I was going. It was late October, cold, but not freezing yet. I packed my car with a cooler full of food, a couple of changes of clothes, a hunting knife I kept for protection, some basic tools, a book I'd been meaning to read, and a battery-powered lantern. I left early in the morning and drove for hours. By the time I turned off the main highway, I hadn't seen another car in over 30 minutes. The road narrowed, winding through thick trees that pressed close on both sides. Then it turned to gravel, then dirt. I followed the directions printed on a piece of paper since my GPS had cut out about an hour earlier. Eventually, I reached a rusted metal gate hanging crooked on one hinge. It wasn't locked. I got out, swung it open, and drove through. The cabin wasn't far beyond that. It was even smaller than I expected, maybe 25 feet long, 15 feet wide, with a sagging front porch and 2 narrow steps leading to the front door. There were no other buildings in sight, just trees, tall, dark trees in every direction. A small clearing surrounded the cabin, but it looked like nature had started reclaiming it long ago. Fallen branches, damp leaves, and patches of moss covered the ground. A narrow footpath disappeared into the woods behind the cabin. I assumed it led to a lake or maybe an old logging road, but I didn't plan on exploring it much. I unpacked, started the generator to get some lights on, and checked inside. The place smelled like wood and dust. There was one main room with a small table, a chair, a cot in the corner with a thin mattress, and a wood-burning stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A narrow door in the back led to a bathroom with a cracked mirror and a composting toilet. That was it. No shower, no running water. There was a plastic drum outside with a spigot and some bottles inside labeled filtered. I figured that was good enough for washing up. It was quiet. I mean, truly quiet. The kind of quiet you don't get in cities or even in the suburbs. No cars in the distance. No neighbors talking. Just the occasional wind in the trees or a bird overhead. That first day, I sat on the porch for a long time, just watching the sun go down behind the trees. Felt good. It felt like I had finally stepped out of my life for a little while and let everything fall away. But something felt off that first night. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't anything obvious. No sounds, no lights, nothing weird. Just a feeling, a heaviness I couldn't shake. I chalked it up to nerves. Maybe the isolation was hitting me harder than I expected. I'd never been that far from civilization by myself before. I locked the door, turned off the lantern, and tried to sleep. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up. It was dead silent except for the occasional pop from the stove and creaks in the old walls. At one point, maybe around 3 a.m., I thought I heard something moving outside. It was soft, barely there. Maybe a couple of footsteps in the leaves. Then nothing. I stayed still in the cot, heart pounding, until I finally drifted back off. The next day, I went for a walk. I figured getting used to the woods would help. I followed that path behind the cabin for a couple miles. It twisted through the forest, up and down small hills, over streams, through patches of thick undergrowth. I didn't see any animals, just the occasional bird or squirrel, but I felt watched. I kept turning around, sure I'd see someone behind me, but there was never anyone there. After a while, I turned back. On the way, I noticed something strange. A pile of rocks just off the trail. They were stacked in a deliberate shape like a small tower, maybe 2 feet high. It looked recent, The leaves hadn't fallen over it yet. I didn't touch it, just looked at it and kept walking. Back at the cabin, I spent the rest of the day reading and chopping some firewood. The generator ran low around dinner time, so I turned it off to save fuel and lit the lantern. I ate cold beans from a can and tried to tell myself that nothing felt wrong. But it did. It felt wrong in a way I couldn't name, like something was off balance. Not broken, but shifted just enough to feel it in your bones. That night, I locked the door again and put the knife on the table next to my cot. I didn't sleep. Not really. I drifted in and out. At some point, I heard the same thing again, movement outside. But this time, it was more definite. Leaves crunching. Something walking around the cabin. Slow, steady. Circled once, paused, then circled again. I sat up, holding the knife. My heart was racing so hard I felt lightheaded. Then it stopped. No footsteps, no sounds, just silence. I waited. Maybe an hour passed. I don't know. I must have dozed off eventually. In the morning, I checked outside. I found footprints in the dirt. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet, human. They went around the cabin, then disappeared into the woods. The stride was strange, short, like whoever it was had been crouching or dragging a leg. I stared at them for a long time. Then I made the worst decision I could have made. I stayed. I don't know why. Pride, maybe. I didn't want to admit I was scared. I told myself it was probably just some local messing around. Maybe a homeless guy or a drifter. That made more sense than anything else I could think of. Still, I kept the knife closer that day. I stayed on the porch most of the time where I could see all around. I didn't go back into the woods. I kept glancing at the tree line, expecting to see someone standing there. But it was just trees. Always just trees. That night, it got worse. It was cold, so I got the fire going strong in the stove. The lantern's batteries were low, but I kept it on. I didn't want to be in the dark. Not after what I'd heard the night before. I didn't even try to sleep in the cot. I sat in the chair with my knife in one hand and the lantern on the table next to me. Sometime after midnight, I heard a noise. Not footsteps this time. Something tapping, light but sharp, came from the back wall. Tap, tap, tap. Then it stopped. Then again, tap, 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 this time on the front wall. I stood up slowly, every hair on my body standing straight up. I moved to the window beside the door and pulled the curtain back just an inch. There was a person crouching in the clearing. Not moving, just crouched low, facing the cabin. I couldn't see their face. They weren't wearing a shirt. Their skin looked pale and dirty. Their arms hung low, hands close to the ground. They didn't move. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. Eventually, I stepped away from the window and sat back down. I didn't know what to do. Call for help? No service. Drive away? The only road out was a single dirt path through miles of forest, and I'd have to go past whoever that was to get to the car. I stayed inside until morning. When the sun finally came up, they were gone. I packed everything. All my gear, all my food, everything. I didn't care if I left anything behind. I threw it all into the car, started the engine, and drove. I didn't even shut the door to the cabin. I just left. As I drove back through the trees, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. A shape just off the path. It stepped back into the woods when I turned to look, but I saw enough to know it wasn't just a trick of the light. It was a person, or something close enough. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road. I didn't tell anyone. What would I say? I rented a cabin in the woods and some half-naked guys stalked around outside all night? No one would believe it. They'd say it was a bear or my imagination, or that I was sleep-deprived. Maybe they'd be right, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard, and I know how it felt. I never went back. A few weeks later, I tried to find the listing again, just out of curiosity. It was gone. The entire post had been deleted. The forum account that posted it didn't exist anymore. I don't go into the woods alone now. Not ever. I don't go anywhere without telling someone where I'm going. And I keep that knife next to my bed, even at home. I don't know who that was. I don't know how long they'd been out there, or why they watched the cabin. Maybe they lived in those woods. Maybe they didn't want me there. Maybe they were just waiting. I spent a week alone at a cabin once, deep in the hills of eastern Tennessee. It was a place I'd rented online. Nothing fancy, just a bare-bones one-room log cabin with a porch, a fireplace, and a little kitchen that ran off propane. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, and no neighbors for miles. That was the whole point. I needed a break. Work had been eating me alive, and I was starting to feel worn out in a way that sleep couldn't fix. I thought isolation might help clear my head. The cabin sat on a gravel road that wound for about 4 miles off a cracked 2-lane highway. Getting there was already a bit of a trial. My sedan bottomed out twice on the last stretch of rutted track. Once I got there, though, I didn't plan to leave. I'd brought enough food, water, and firewood to last a week, plus a cooler full of ice and simple groceries. I had books, a notebook, a folding camp chair. I was prepared to disappear for a while. The first couple of days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I woke up with the sun, cooked simple meals, and spent my time reading or walking the woods around the cabin. There was a narrow trail leading down to a small creek a few hundred yards downhill. I'd sit there for hours just listening to the water and the wind through the trees. The quiet was a shock at first, but in a good way. After a while, it started to feel normal. It was on the third night that something started to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it exactly, just a kind of tension in the air, like when the sky goes heavy before a storm. I went to bed early and left the fire in the hearth burning low, just to keep the edge off the cold. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why. The cabin was dark except for the dying fire, and the wind outside had picked up. I lay still for a while, listening. I thought maybe it was an animal, maybe a raccoon nosing around the porch, but I didn't hear any footsteps or scratching, just wind. But the feeling of wrongness didn't go away. The next morning, I stepped outside to check around. The gravel driveway was undisturbed, and I didn't see any tracks. Still, I couldn't shake the idea that something had woken me up. I tried to brush it off. I figured it was just my brain getting used to the quiet. But that night, the feeling came back stronger. It started with little things. A faint creaking sound, like the porch boards shifting. The wind outside whistling strangely, almost rhythmically, through the trees. I kept telling myself it was all in my head. Maybe it was, but I couldn't sleep. At some point around midnight, I lit the lantern and stepped outside. The night was pitch black. No stars, no moon. The clouds had rolled in thick. I could barely see 10 feet past the porch. The air felt different, still but charged somehow. I stood out there for a long time, scanning the woods. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. Eventually, I turned back inside and locked the door behind me. I added a couple more logs to the fire and sat in the armchair with a blanket around my shoulders, trying to read. I don't remember falling asleep. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I noticed was the front door. It was unlocked. I know for a fact I locked it. I remember the feeling of the cold metal knob in my hand, the sound of the bolt sliding home. I stood there staring at it, heart thumping. I checked the cabin. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing missing. No sign of a break-in. But something was wrong. I spent the whole day on edge. I kept thinking about whether someone could have been out there in the woods, watching me. The cabin didn't have curtains, so at night the windows were just dark squares showing whatever was outside. And that night the wind came back, stronger than before. I tried to sleep, but I kept hearing sounds. Snaps, cracks, dragging noises in the brush. Every time I looked outside, there was nothing, just trees and wind. I sat up until the fire died again and didn't fall asleep until just before dawn. In the morning, I walked around the perimeter of the cabin. That's when I found the tracks. Not boot prints, bare feet. Human. The ground was still soft from rain the day before, and the prints were clear. They led from the woods to the cabin, circled the porch, then disappeared back into the trees. I felt sick. My hands were shaking. The rational part of my brain tried to come up with explanations. Maybe some homeless person living off-grid, maybe a lost hiker. But the prints were dry. Whatever made them came through after the rain had stopped. And they were close, right up against the porch. That was the 5th day. I wanted to leave, but part of me still clung to the idea that it was nothing. I didn't want to abandon the plan. I didn't want to admit I was scared, but that night broke me. It started with the sound of something moving through the woods. Slowly, steadily. Heavy footsteps, branches snapping. I turned off all the lights and sat in the dark, staring out the front window. I could see just far enough to make out movement between the trees. It was a person, definitely a person. They were standing maybe 30 or 40 feet away, just beyond the tree line. They weren't moving anymore, just standing there, watching. I backed away from the window and sat on the floor, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. After what felt like an hour, I crawled to the back of the cabin and waited until the sky started to lighten. When I looked out again, they were gone. I didn't pack. I didn't clean. I just threw everything into the car and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I made it to a gas station with cell service, and I sat in the parking lot for half an hour before I felt steady enough to keep driving. A few days later, I emailed the owner and said something had come up and I had to leave early. I didn't mention the footprints or the person. I didn't want to talk about it. I still don't, really. Looking back, I don't know who that was. I don't know if it was one person or more. I don't know how long they'd been out there, watching. All I know is that for at least one night, someone stood in the dark and watched me through those windows. That's not something you forget. I haven't been back to the woods since. Not alone. Not even close. The quiet that I once thought would save me ended up showing me just how much can hide in it, and how thin the walls really are when you're that far from help. I still think about that cabin sometimes, about the prints in the dirt, about the shape standing in the trees, and about how I never heard them walk away. I woke up that morning feeling more drained than usual. The weight of the past few months had built up, and I needed to get away. So, I decided to rent a small, secluded cabin deep in the woods for a few days. No phone, no distractions, just nature, silence, and the hope of finding some peace. The cabin was tucked away in the dense woods, far from the nearest town. A small dirt road led up to it, surrounded by tall trees and thick brush. I'd never been a fan of isolated places, but something about the deep woods called to me. I needed to disconnect, to escape from the grind of everyday life. The cabin itself was rustic, old wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and a thick, musty smell that clung to the air. It was exactly what I had imagined. Simple, quiet, and far removed from the world I was trying to leave behind. After unpacking my things and getting settled, I took a walk around the area to stretch my legs. The woods felt different than usual. The air was thick with humidity, and the silence was almost too much. I couldn't remember the last time I'd been somewhere so quiet, and at first, it was peaceful. But as I walked deeper into the woods, I began to feel something strange. It wasn't like the usual feeling of being alone in nature. It was more like being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I started to get that uneasy sensation that someone or something was observing me. I tried to shake it off, but it lingered. The sounds of the woods, birds chirping, leaves rustling, felt distant, muffled. It was as if everything had become more tense. I returned to the cabin and tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. I built a fire in the hearth and settled in for the night, thinking the isolation was just getting to me. The sun set early, as it always does in the deep woods, casting long shadows over everything. The flames of the fire flickered in the dim room, and I felt myself finally starting to relax. It was just a cabin in the woods, I told myself. Nothing to be afraid of. But then I heard it. A low, guttural growl, distant but unmistakable, came from outside the cabin. My blood ran cold. I froze. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the rest of the world fell silent. That sound, it wasn't the growl of a bear, nor a wolf. It was something different, something far more sinister. It was too deep, too unnatural. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I instinctively grabbed the flashlight beside me, my fingers trembling. Another growl, this time closer, much closer. I could hear the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush outside the cabin. It was a slow, deliberate movement, as if whatever it was knew exactly what it was doing. I had no idea what kind of animal would make such a sound, but I knew one thing. It wasn't something I wanted to meet. The growling continued, almost rhythmic, circling the cabin. It wasn't just one growl. It was several, overlapping, like a chorus of deep, animalistic sounds. I moved quietly to the window, parting the thick curtains just enough to peek outside. My eyes searched the darkness, but all I could see was the thick, oppressive forest, the trees barely swaying in the still air. The growls were gone, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. The only sound was my breathing and the crackling of the fire. There were no other lights, no other sounds. Just me and whatever was outside. I thought about grabbing my phone, but the lack of service out here meant it would be useless. The cabin had no phone line either. I was alone. I tried to push the fear down and made my way to the kitchen to get a drink of water. I needed something to calm my nerves, something to settle the unease crawling under my skin. But as I stood there in the kitchen, I heard something else. A scratching sound, sharp and quick, coming from the door. I froze. My eyes locked on the cabin door, every muscle in my body tense, waiting. The scratching continued, followed by a low, throaty snarl. Whatever was outside was getting closer. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I leave the cabin? I couldn't run into the woods at night. And even if I could, where would I go? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the path was too rugged to navigate in the dark. I considered barricading myself inside, but the cabin didn't have much in terms of security. Old windows, thin wooden doors, nothing that could stop whatever was outside. The scratching at the door grew louder, more frantic. It was as if whatever was out there was testing the door, trying to get in. The snarl echoed in the night air, and my blood turned to ice. I moved slowly, my heart hammering, back toward the window. I needed to see what it was. I could barely make out the shape of something moving in the darkness. It was big, much bigger than any normal animal. The outline was strange, like a tall figure on all fours, but there was something wrong with the proportions. Its back hunched in an unnatural way, and its head was too large, too wide. I could see eyes gleaming in the shadows, reflecting the faint light from the cabin, and they were not the eyes of any animal I knew. The shape lingered in the dark for a moment, and then it was gone. 1 second it was there, the next it disappeared back into the woods, vanishing like a shadow swallowed by the night. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. The growls, the snarl, the scratching, none of it was normal. I waited in silence, staring out into the woods, too scared to move. I don't know how much time passed, minutes, hours, it all blurred together. The unease settled into a pit in my stomach, and I found myself sitting in the corner of the cabin, clutching the flashlight, waiting for the morning. But the night wasn't over yet. The growling came again, this time much closer, right outside the cabin. I could hear the heavy thud of paws, the rhythmic sound of something massive circling the cabin. It was no longer just an animal. This was something intelligent, something deliberate. I could feel its presence outside, moving, tracking, waiting. I held my breath, the flashlight shaking in my hands. It was impossible to tell where the creature was. Could have been right outside the window, staring in at me, but all I could do was wait. The growl echoed one more time, followed by a sharp snarl that made my blood run cold. The thing was pacing now, deliberately moving in a circle around the cabin. I don't know how long I sat there, trying to make myself as small as possible. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and I felt my legs grow weak. Every sound outside seemed amplified, every rustle in the leaves, every crack in the branches. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The creature was gone. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare make a sound. I didn't know if it was gone for good or if it was just waiting, hiding in the darkness, watching me. Could be right outside the door, waiting for me to make a mistake. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I pressed myself into the corner of the cabin, hoping that the silence meant safety. But I knew deep down that I wasn't safe. Hours passed before I dared to open the door. The sun was starting to rise, casting a pale light over the woods. I didn't wait to gather my things. I grabbed my backpack, my keys, and my flashlight, and I left the cabin behind. I didn't look back. I didn't care about the cabin, the woods, or whatever had been lurking out there in the dark. I just wanted to get out of there. Whatever I had seen in the woods was beyond my understanding, and I wasn't sticking around to find out more. I made it to the nearest town, shaken, exhausted, and with the terrifying image of what I had seen in the woods still fresh in my mind. I never went back to that cabin, and I don't plan to. I don't know what it was that I encountered that night, but I know one thing for sure. There are things out there in the woods, things that are best left undisturbed. And whatever that thing was, I don't think it ever left. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. After months of stressful work, I needed a break. A real break. The kind where you can disconnect, breathe fresh air, and forget about the noise of city life. I found a secluded cabin online, tucked away deep in the woods, far enough from the nearest town that I wouldn't see a single person for days. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, no distractions. Just me, nature, and the quiet. It seemed perfect. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip below the treeline. The cabin was more rustic than I had imagined. An old wooden structure with peeling paint and a front porch that looked like it had been forgotten by time. It had that charm about it, weathered but with character. There was a small garden around it, overgrown with weeds, and the air smelled like pine and earth. The place was isolated, but that's exactly what I wanted. The inside of the cabin was even older than I expected. The furniture was mismatched, old leather chairs, a creaky wooden table, and an ancient-looking bookshelf that smelled like dust. The kitchen had the bare essentials: a small stove, a refrigerator, and a rusty sink. The cabin's single bedroom was cozy, with a thick quilt on the bed and a view of the woods through the window. It was peaceful, quiet, and just what I needed. I unpacked my things, made myself a cup of tea, and sat by the window, watching as the last rays of sunlight flickered through the trees. There was no one around, just the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves. It was perfect. I spent the evening reading, enjoying the solitude, and as night fell, I turned off the lights and went to bed. The cabin creaked and groaned as the wind picked up, but I was used to the sounds of old houses. It didn't bother me. Around midnight, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe I had just stirred in my sleep. But then I heard something, a soft scraping noise, like something moving across the floor. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately sat up in bed. The room was dark, and the only sound was the wind outside. I waited, straining my ears, but there was nothing else. Maybe it was just the house settling, I thought, trying to calm myself. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. A soft shuffle, followed by the sound of something scraping against the floorboards. I swung my legs out of bed and stood up. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I moved toward the door. The cabin was eerily silent. The only sound now the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. I reached the door and stood in the doorway, staring into the dark hallway outside my room. Nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe an animal had gotten inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air in the cabin felt heavy now, like it was pressing in on me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I listened carefully, but all I could hear was the wind outside. I decided to check the rest of the cabin. I moved down the hallway, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The living room was empty, the shadows shifting as the trees swayed outside. The kitchen was still, the faint smell of old wood and rust hanging in the air. I checked the bathroom, the closet, and the back door, but everything seemed normal. There was no sign of anyone or anything out of the ordinary. I returned to my room and locked the door, trying to convince myself it was just nerves. But as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The scratching sounds had stopped, but something still felt off. My eyes darted around the room, scanning for any sign of movement. The wind had died down, leaving the cabin in complete silence. I tried to sleep, But every time I closed my eyes, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. I must have drifted off eventually because the next thing I knew, the first light of dawn was creeping through the window. I had barely slept, but I was exhausted. The eerie feeling from the night before still lingered, but I tried to shake it off. I made myself some coffee and sat on the porch, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The morning was calm, the sun brightening the woods around me. Felt like a fresh start, but that uneasy feeling remained. I decided to explore the area, maybe take a walk and stretch my legs. I grabbed my jacket and set out, following the small trail that led through the trees. The woods were peaceful, the only sound the crunching of leaves underfoot. But as I walked deeper into the forest, I started to feel that same sense of being watched, like eyes were following me from the shadows. I shook the feeling off again and kept walking, but the feeling didn't go away. I turned back toward the cabin, trying to ignore the discomfort creeping into my mind. As I approached the cabin, something caught my eye. There, standing just beyond the porch, was a woman. She was tall, thin, and dressed in a faded, old-fashioned dress. Her hair was long and unkempt, hanging in tangled strands around her face. She was staring at me, unmoving, her eyes wide and unblinking. I froze. My heart slammed in my chest, and my breath caught in my throat. The woman didn't say anything, didn't move a muscle. She just stood there, watching me. A wave of panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe she was lost? Maybe she was just some strange person who had wandered into the woods? But as I took a step forward, she didn't move. She didn't acknowledge me at all. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. I took another cautious step toward her, and just then, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees as silently as she had appeared. My body went cold, and I felt a knot of fear tighten in my stomach. I stood there, frozen, for a long time. What the hell had just happened? Who was that woman? And why was she out here, alone, in the middle of nowhere? I didn't know, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I rushed inside the cabin, locked the door behind me, and sat by the window, my eyes scanning the trees. The cabin felt claustrophobic now, the walls pressing in on me. I couldn't stop thinking about the woman, the way she had looked at me, the way she hadn't reacted when I saw her. It felt like I had interrupted something, like she had been waiting for me to notice her. I stayed inside for the rest of the day, too frightened to step outside again. The woods seemed to press in on me, the trees standing like silent sentinels, watching, waiting. As night fell, the scratching sounds from the previous night returned. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. The woman's image, her strange, unblinking stare, kept replaying in my mind. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside, sent my heart racing. I kept thinking I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, glimpses of something or someone in the shadows. But whenever I looked directly, there was nothing there. The cabin felt suffocating, and I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. The next morning, I packed my things and left the cabin. I didn't bother to check the surroundings or even look for the woman again. I just wanted to get out of there, to escape whatever had been lurking in the woods. I locked up the cabin, and without looking back, I drove away, the sense of dread never leaving me. I don't know who that woman was or what she was doing out there in the woods, but I do know this: whatever it wasn't friendly. The memory of her unblinking stare still haunts me, and I've never gone back to that cabin again. I don't know what she wanted, but I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something terrible. And I'll never forget the way she looked at me, as if I was the one who didn't belong. I had always been a fan of getting away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. So when I found a small, secluded cabin for rent deep in the woods, I jumped at the opportunity. It wasn't far from the nearest town, but it felt like it was in the middle of nowhere. Just the thought of it. A small wooden cabin, surrounded by towering trees, with nothing but the sounds of nature filling the air, was enough to make me eager to get away from the noise of the city and disconnect for a while. I packed my bags, gathered up some supplies, and headed out. The The drive was longer than I anticipated, winding down narrow country roads, passing through fields, and eventually into dense forests. The further I went, the fewer people I saw. There was no cell phone service, no streetlights, just me and the wilderness. After a few hours of driving, I finally turned onto a gravel road, which led up to the cabin. It was even more isolated than I expected, with the only sounds being the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call. When I arrived, I was greeted by an old wooden cabin with a wraparound porch. It looked well-worn, with peeling paint and some ivy creeping up the side, but it was charming in its own way. The cabin was small, just one bedroom, a living area, and a tiny kitchen. The interior was rustic, with old furniture that seemed to have been there for decades. A wood stove sat in the corner, ready to keep the place warm. There was a small bathroom, and the only modern touch was a simple generator-powered light system. It was exactly what I wanted. Isolated, peaceful, and free of distractions. I settled in, unpacking my things and setting up the space. I had a book I'd been meaning to read, so I sat by the window with a cup of coffee, enjoying the stillness around me. The wind picked up a little as the evening wore on, making the trees sway and creak. I could hear the occasional rustle in the leaves, but it didn't bother me. In fact, it added to the charm of the place. That night, after eating a quick dinner, I settled into bed early. I was exhausted from the long drive and the fresh air, so I fell asleep quickly. The cabin creaked and groaned as the wind picked up, and I couldn't help but smile to myself. It was exactly what I needed. But around midnight, something woke me up. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. I thought I had just stirred in my sleep, but then I heard it. An unmistakable scratching noise coming from outside. It wasn't the wind or the trees. This sound was more deliberate. It was like something or someone was pawing at the door. I lay still, my heart starting to race. The sound continued, a slow, deliberate scraping against the wood. It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the porch. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog, something that had been attracted to the cabin. I had read that wild animals sometimes wander into cabins if they smell food or hear people. But as I listened more carefully, I realized that this sound didn't quite fit with the usual animal noises I was used to hearing. The scratching stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe it had gone away. But then I heard something else. A low growl followed by a series of quick sniffs. My breath caught in my throat. That didn't sound like a raccoon. It didn't even sound like a normal dog. This growl was deep and guttural, like something much larger and more menacing. I slowly got out of bed and tiptoed to the window, trying to peer outside without making any noise. The moonlight illuminated the area around the cabin just enough for me to see. I scanned the porch, but I didn't see anything. Nothing moving, no sign of whatever had been making that sound. The growl echoed in my mind, but I still didn't see anything. I decided to check the door. I made my way cautiously to the front, carefully avoiding the creaky floorboards, and I peeked through the peephole. There, just beyond the edge of the porch, I saw a shadow. It was too dark to make out exactly what it was, but it was big, much bigger than a dog. It was hunched low to the ground, its back arched, almost like it was stalking something. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel its presence. Something about the way it moved or didn't move made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My heart was pounding now. I wanted to retreat back into the safety of my room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The growling continued, low and steady, like it was waiting for something. I stayed in the doorway for what felt like hours, but the creature never moved. It just sat there in the shadows, watching the cabin. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because when I woke up again, the sun was rising. The scratching and growling had stopped, but the air felt heavier. I felt a sense of dread hanging over me, like something was wrong. I looked out the window again, but this time, the porch was empty. There were no signs of any animals or creatures. Everything seemed normal. It almost felt like I had imagined the whole thing. I tried to push it out of my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, something that hadn't been human. I went about my day, taking a walk around the property to try to clear my head. As I walked through the woods, I started to notice strange things. Broken branches, large paw prints in the mud, and a distinct smell. Something musky and wild, not quite like anything I had ever smelled before. I kept walking, trying to convince myself that it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Later that evening, as the sun set and the shadows grew longer, I heard it again, the sound of scratching, coming from the same place on the porch. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight, bolted the door, and locked the windows. I stood at the window, shining the light outside, but again, there was nothing. The porch was empty, just like it had been earlier, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I decided to leave the cabin the next morning. I packed up my things quickly, not bothering to check for the creature or whatever had been lurking outside. I didn't want to stick around to find out. I locked up the cabin and started the long drive back home, the sense of unease never leaving me. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I felt like I was being followed. I couldn't explain what had happened at the cabin. Was it an animal? Or was it something else entirely? Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I would never know for sure. All I knew was that I wasn't going back to that cabin. Not ever again. The feeling that something had been watching me, that something had been waiting for me to leave, stayed with me long after I had driven away. And I never did find out what that creature was. The cabin was supposed to be a retreat, a place where I could get away from the chaos of life for a weekend. I'd planned it for months, picked the spot, rented the cabin, arranged the time off work. It was located deep in the woods, about a 3-hour drive from my place. I was used to being alone, so the idea of spending a weekend in a remote cabin, without the noise of the city or the constant distractions of modern life, sounded perfect. The drive there was peaceful enough. The further I went, the fewer cars I saw. The roads got narrower, and the trees began to crowd closer to the sides of the car. The radio had long gone silent, and the phone signal had faded away somewhere back near the last small town I passed. At first, I was a little nervous about how isolated I was, but the excitement of getting to the cabin quickly pushed those thoughts out of my mind. When I finally arrived, the cabin was even more rustic than I had imagined. It was small, built from old wood, weathered by years of standing in the elements. The windows were large, framed by a wraparound porch. There was a stone chimney and a heavy iron door handle that squeaked as I turned it to let myself in. Inside, it was cozy, small, but just right for a weekend stay. The floors creaked as I walked through, the scent of wood and fresh air hanging in the room. A fire had already been started in the fireplace, the faint smell of burning pine filling the air. The place had an old-fashioned charm to it, and I felt immediately at ease. I spent the rest of the evening unpacking my things, settling in, and lighting the lamps around the cabin. The last thing I wanted was to be stuck in the dark out here, so I made sure the place felt welcoming and warm. I cooked a simple meal, just something easy for one person, and settled down by the fire to enjoy it. There were no sounds but the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind outside. It felt like a world away from everything. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own thoughts for the first time in a while. The night crept on, and I started to feel the weight of the day catching up with me. My eyelids grew heavy, and soon enough I decided to call it a night. I put out the fire, locked the door, and climbed into bed, pulling the blankets tightly around me. The wind howled outside, but it wasn't anything unusual. I had grown up in a house surrounded by trees, and the sound of the wind was comforting to me. I woke up in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was the wind again, but then I realized the sound was different. It wasn't the usual moaning of trees or the low rumbling of the storm outside. This was something distinct, something more deliberate. It sounded like footsteps, soft at first, then growing louder and more distinct. I lay there frozen in bed, listening. The sound came from outside the cabin, moving slowly, deliberately. They were getting closer. I strained my ears, trying to figure out what it was. A raccoon? Maybe some kind of animal, I thought. But the steps didn't sound like an animal. They were too heavy, too deliberate. My heart began to beat faster, and I instinctively pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, suddenly feeling exposed. The steps stopped right outside the window. I could hear them clearly now. Someone was outside my cabin, standing there, just beyond the glass. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. My mind raced with possible explanations, none of which made me feel any better. Maybe it was a hiker, someone lost or stranded. Maybe it was some stranger passing through, but why would they be out there, at this hour, in the middle of nowhere? The questions raced in my mind, but they didn't make any sense. I stayed still, not moving a muscle. The footsteps resumed, but now they circled the cabin. Slowly, methodically, I listened, my body tense, every nerve screaming at me to do something, anything, but I was paralyzed. The footsteps didn't seem to be in a hurry. They weren't even walking directly around the cabin. They seemed to be exploring, moving around the edges of the building, stopping here and there, as though checking the corners. And then, for what felt like an eternity, there was silence. I held my breath, straining to listen for any sign of movement. Nothing. Absolute stillness. The kind of silence that felt suffocating. After what felt like an hour of waiting, I finally gathered the courage to sit up in bed. I slowly crept to the window, trying not to make any noise. I peered out through the blinds, my heart pounding in my chest. The moonlight illuminated the area around the cabin, casting long shadows across the ground. There was no one there, no footsteps, no sign of any movement, but something about the stillness felt wrong. Felt like someone had been there, someone who didn't belong. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I spent the next few hours staring at the window, trying to convince myself it was nothing, that it was just the wind playing tricks on my mind. But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. Something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. When morning finally came, I was exhausted. I hadn't gotten a wink of sleep, but I forced myself to get up and start the day. The first thing I did was check the area outside the cabin. I looked around the windows, checked the porch, and even walked a little ways into the woods nearby. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints in the dirt, no broken branches, no indication that anything unusual had happened during the night. I felt a little ridiculous for having been so paranoid. After all, this was a remote area. People had to pass through here occasionally, right? Maybe it had just been a hiker or someone else staying in one of the nearby cabins. But still, something gnawed at me. The rest of the day was uneventful. I spent my time outside, taking a long walk through the woods and just trying to clear my head. The strange footsteps from the night before seemed like a distant memory, but there was still a part of me that couldn't fully let go of the unease. As the evening drew near, I found myself feeling anxious again. The thought of spending another night in that cabin, alone, after what had happened, was unsettling. But I wasn't about to leave. I couldn't let my mind run away with me. I reminded myself it was probably just an animal or some other logical explanation. Nothing to worry about. Night fell again, and I locked all the doors and windows, just like I had the night before. But this time, I didn't go straight to bed. I stayed up, pacing around the cabin, trying to keep busy. I kept the lights on, and I kept glancing nervously at the windows. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me. But as the hours passed, I finally calmed down and decided to try to sleep. Maybe I was overthinking it. Just as I was about to crawl into bed, I heard it again. The soft, deliberate footsteps. This time, they came from the back of the cabin. Slowly, they circled around to the front. I froze, listening intently. My heart was pounding in my chest. There was no mistaking it this time. Someone was out there. I wasn't going to wait around to see what happened next. I grabbed my flashlight and my phone, my hands shaking as I ran to the door. I opened it slowly, trying not to make a sound. I stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but there was no one around. The steps had stopped again, just like the night before. I checked every corner of the cabin, walked all the way around it, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no movement. I stood there for a long time, my flashlight scanning the woods around me, but there was nothing. I don't know why, but I had this overwhelming feeling that I had just missed something, that whoever was out there had been watching me, waiting for me to leave the safety of the cabin. But now there was nothing, just the wind. I didn't spend another night in that cabin. I packed my things and left early the next morning. The drive home was a blur. I didn't stop. I just wanted to get out of there. The whole time, I kept thinking about the footsteps and the way they circled the cabin. Who was out there? Why had they been so deliberate? And why had they disappeared without a trace? I'll never know, but I don't think I'll ever go back to that cabin again. Not after what happened. Some things are better left alone, lost in the woods, hidden in the dark. I woke up one morning in a cabin deep in the woods, with the sun just starting to rise through the trees outside. The air was still thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. I hadn't planned to be here alone, but circumstances had forced me into a situation where I found myself on my own for the weekend. My friends, who were supposed to join me, had bailed out at the last minute due to work or family emergencies. But I had already booked the cabin, and there was no way I was going to cancel. The place had been on my bucket list for years. It was the kind of rustic retreat where you could escape everything. The noise, the people, the daily grind, and just be alone to think, breathe, and maybe even reconnect with something inside you that had long been buried. I hadn't expected to feel quite so isolated, though. The cabin was small but cozy, built in the style of a traditional log home with a slanted roof and wide windows. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the wood smelled of age and firewood. It had a simple, almost charming rustic feel. The furniture was old but functional, the kitchen basic, with an old cast-iron stove and a few mismatched chairs around a sturdy wooden table. There was a stone fireplace at the far end of the living room, which I'd lit the night before. The fire had died out, leaving behind only a faint scent of smoke and the warm glow that lingered on the stone. I'd arrived the evening before, just as the light had started to fade. The drive had been long, over 3 hours, on winding, narrow roads that seemed to get more remote the further I went. The final stretch had taken me through an area where the trees were so thick, they almost seemed to close in around the car. It was eerie, but not necessarily in a bad way. It felt like a place untouched by time, a place where the world outside simply didn't exist. That evening, I unpacked my things, cooked a simple meal, and settled into the cabin with a book. As the night fell, I started to get the sense that something was off, though. The silence was profound, like it had a weight to it. The only sounds I could hear were the occasional gusts of wind rattling the trees outside and the crackling of the fire. I kept my lights dim, not wanting to disturb the peace. The cabin felt too quiet, too empty, and a little unnerving, but I tried to push those thoughts aside. It was just my imagination, I told myself. After all, it's just a cabin in the woods, nothing more. The first night passed without incident, but when I woke up that morning, I noticed something that set my nerves on edge. The door to the cabin, which I had locked the night before, was slightly ajar. It was such a small thing, but it made my skin crawl. I couldn't remember leaving it open. My mind raced, going through every scenario that might explain it. Maybe the wind had blown it open? But that didn't make sense, not with how tightly I had closed it. I got up, walked over to it, and checked the latch. It wasn't broken, and there was no sign that anything had been disturbed. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. I checked the cabin's windows next, making sure they were all secure. They were. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence. There was something in the air that day, something that felt off, like the calm before a storm. It was almost like the woods were holding their breath. Trying to push the unsettling thought from my mind, I decided to go for a walk. I figured a nice, long hike would help clear my head. I grabbed my jacket, laced up my boots, and stepped outside. The air was cool and crisp, the kind of cold that makes your skin prickle but doesn't freeze you. I wandered through the woods, taking in the natural beauty around me. The trees towered above, their thick trunks rising high into the sky. The underbrush was thick with ferns and moss, and every now and then, I would spot a patch of wildflowers or hear the rustling of small creatures in the leaves. But as I walked deeper into the forest, the peacefulness of the woods began to feel increasingly oppressive. It was like the woods were closing in, the trees seeming to grow thicker the further I went. It was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The chirping of birds was absent, and there was no sound of insects buzzing. The only thing I could hear was the crunch of my boots on the forest floor and the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. I tried to ignore the feeling creeping over me. It was probably nothing, just my mind getting the best of me. After about an hour of walking, I found myself on a small clearing with a creek running through it. The sound of running water was soothing, and I stood there for a while, taking in the view. The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light across the forest floor. It was beautiful, calming even, and for a moment, I thought I had shaken off the unease that had been nagging at me. But then I noticed something strange. On the far side of the creek, there was a small cabin, barely visible through the trees. It was old, weathered, and seemed almost forgotten, blending in with the landscape. It didn't make sense. I was sure I hadn't seen it on my way in, and it certainly wasn't marked on any maps of the area. But there it was, standing in the middle of the woods, almost hidden from view. It was far too small to be a house, more like a shed or an old, abandoned structure. I stood there for a while, staring at it. It looked like no one had lived in it for years. The wood was rotting, the roof sagging, and the windows were completely boarded up. Something about it sent a chill through me. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. I debated walking over to it, curiosity getting the best of me, but I decided against it. Something told me not to. Instead, I turned back toward the cabin where I was staying. The walk back was uneventful, but the feeling of being watched kept gnawing at me. The woods seemed to grow darker, more menacing with each step I took. When I finally reached the cabin, I slammed the door behind me, locking it twice. The sense of safety from the walls felt temporary, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the cabin for the rest of the day. I didn't even go outside to gather firewood for the evening. As the sun began to set, the strange feeling that had been with me all day seemed to grow stronger. It wasn't just the woods, it was the cabin itself. I kept hearing odd noises, like footsteps outside, but when I checked, there was nothing there. The wind had picked up, and the trees outside creaked and groaned, but it felt different, as if there were someone out there, moving in the shadows. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer and went outside, just to check around the cabin. The beam of light sliced through the dark, but there was nothing there. I circled the cabin once, checking every corner, every window. Everything was as it should be, but still I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I tried to sleep, but the unease kept me awake. I kept thinking about the cabin I had seen earlier, hidden away in the woods. What was it? Why had I never seen it before? Was it abandoned, or was someone living there? My mind kept turning over the possibilities, but no matter how many scenarios I came up with, none of them made sense. I had been so sure there was nothing out there when I first arrived, but now I wasn't so sure. Around 2 a.m., I heard a noise that made my heart stop. It wasn't a tree branch scraping against the cabin or an animal stirring in the night. It was a soft tapping, almost rhythmic, coming from the wall of the cabin just outside my bedroom window. I held my breath, straining to hear. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came again, followed by a pause, and then another tap, a little louder this time. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to know what it was. I grabbed the flashlight again, and before I could stop myself, I opened the window. I peered outside, scanning the area around the cabin. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I saw nothing. There was no one there. The tapping had stopped. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, I closed the window and locked it. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I left. I packed my things as quickly as I could, barely able to think straight. I didn't even bother to check out. I just got in my car and drove off, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. As I drove down the long, narrow road back to civilization, I passed the place where I had seen that strange, abandoned cabin. It was gone. The trees had grown thicker there, and the area looked completely different, like the cabin had never existed at all. I don't know what happened that weekend. I don't know if I was just imagining things, or if there was something truly off about that place. But I do know one thing: I never went back.